Hello and welcome to The Quiet Historian. Imagine a city built on the back of an extinct volcano. No natural harbour and no great river, no gentle rolling plains for armies to march across, standing exposed on jagged cliffs in the cold mists of the north. By all logic, this city should have remained a frontier outpost, a forgotten stronghold in the Scottish Highlands. And yet, for over 1,000 years, this impossible place has been the beating heart of a proud and defiant nation. This is the story of Edinburgh. So how did they do it? How did a fortress on a rock become the Athens of the North? How did a city with no natural advantages create a culture that would reshape the modern world? Tonight, we will tell the epic story of Edinburgh from ancient times to the present. We will walk through the shadow of its ancient castle. We will stand in the narrow winds where reformers preached revolution. We will meet a tragic queen whose story became legend. We will witness the birth of ideas that would change how humanity thinks about science, philosophy, and human nature itself. We will see how a small northern city gave birth to the Scottish Enlightenment and sent its influence across the globe. This is a story of incredible resilience and intellectual brilliance. It is also the story of a city that never surrendered, of a people who chose freedom over comfort again and again, even when surrender would have been easier. But before we begin our journey, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. So I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away and let us travel back to a time of mist and stone, of Highland warriors and ancient fortresses, of philosophical debates that would echo through the centuries to a world that smelled of heather and peat smoke. The story of Edinburgh begins not with grandeur, but with naked survival. In the 1st century before Christ, the borderlands between what's now Scotland and England were home to a Celtic tribe called the Votadini. It was a harsh and beautiful land of rolling hills covered in purple heather, of windswept moors where nothing grew but tough grass and thorny bushes. The Romans would later call this region Caledonia, the land of the hard men. The Votadini were indeed hard people, warriors and cattle herders who had learned to survive in a landscape that showed no mercy to the weak or unprepared. They lived in a world of constant danger. Rival tribes raided their cattle and burned their settlements. Roman legions pushed north from their fortified wall, seeking slaves and tribute. Wild animals prowled the forests. The weather itself could kill the unwary. In such a world, survival depended on choosing the right place to make your stand. The Votadini built their settlements on hilltops, not for the beauty of the view, but for the practical advantage of defense. From a hilltop, you could see enemies approaching from miles away. You could rain arrows and stones down on attackers trying to climb the slopes. You could retreat to your stronghold when the odds were against you and wait for the enemy to grow tired and move on. But of all the hilltops in their territory, one stood apart from all the others. It was a massive outcrop of black volcanic rock that rose like a clenched fist from the surrounding plain. The rock was over 300 feet high, its sides formed of sheer cliffs of ancient basalt that had been forged in the fires of the earth millions of years before humans walked this land. The cliffs were so steep that a man could not climb them without ropes and iron tools. Birds nested in the cracks and crevices, but even they had trouble finding purchase on the smooth black stone. Only on the eastern side was there a path of sorts, a narrow ridge of rock that connected the summit to the surrounding land. But this path was treacherous in the extreme. It was barely wide enough for 2 men to walk side by side. One false step could send a climber tumbling to his death on the rocks below. In winter, ice made the path impassable. In summer, rain turned the stones slippery and dangerous. Yet this terrible path was also the rock's great strength. No army could charge up that narrow ridge. Attackers would have to climb in single file, easy targets for defenders positioned above. The summit of the rock was not large, perhaps 5 acres of wind-swept stone. It was not a hospitable place to live. The winds that swept across the top could knock a strong man to his knees. Rain and snow turned the exposed rock treacherous. There was no shelter from the elements, except what human hands could build. But the rock offered one thing that no amount of gold could buy in that violent age. It offered absolute security. The Votadini looked up at that volcanic summit and saw not hardship but safety. They saw a place where they could make their final stand if all else failed. They called it Din Aiden, the fortress of Aiden. The name would survive the fall of empires and the rise of new nations. We know it as Edinburgh. What they could never have imagined was that their fortress, built for war, would one day become a citadel of learning that would enlighten the world. The Votadini faced a terrible choice: build on impossible ground or die on the plains below. They chose the rock. For generations they hauled stones up that killing path. 6 men to carry the largest blocks, children carrying what they could. The work never stopped because the Romans were coming. And in the year 79 AD, they arrived. The most disciplined and ruthless military force the world had ever seen came to Scotland. The Roman legions had conquered Gaul under Julius Caesar. They had invaded Britain under Claudius. They had crushed the rebellion of Boudicca and burned her cities to ash. Now they were coming north under the governor Agricola to complete the conquest of the entire island. The Romans were not barbarians, despite what their enemies claimed. They were engineers and administrators, builders of roads and aqueducts and systems of law that would endure for centuries. But they were also utterly ruthless when it came to crushing resistance to their rule. They had perfected the art of siege warfare over centuries of conquest. They could build walls and towers and catapults with terrifying efficiency. They could starve a city into submission or storm its walls with disciplined precision. Their legionaries were professionals who trained every day for the art of killing. Their auxiliaries included cavalry and archers recruited from every corner of their vast empire. When Agricola led his legions into Caledonia, he found a landscape unlike any he had conquered before. The hills were shrouded in mist that seemed to rise from the very ground. The forests were dark and full of hidden enemies who struck without warning and melted away like shadows. The people themselves were different from the Gauls or Britons the Romans had conquered further south. They were wilder, fiercer, more willing to die than to submit. Agricola pushed north methodically, burning villages and defeating tribal armies that dared to meet him in open battle. His legions built camps each night, surrounded by walls and ditches that could withstand any attack. They advanced like a great machine, crushing everything in their path. But when they came to Din Aiden, the great machine stopped. Agricola was a practical man. He had conquered most of Britain by choosing his battles carefully, by attacking where he was strong, and avoiding fights that would cost him more than he could afford to lose. He stood at the base of the volcanic rock and looked up at the fortress on its summit. He saw the narrow path that attackers would have to climb. He saw the walls that crowned the cliff top. He calculated the cost in Roman blood that taking such a place would require. His chief engineer, a grizzled veteran of 20 campaigns, counted the defenders' spears glinting on the ramparts and shook his head. "Too many will die for too little gain," the man whispered. His engineers examined the rock from every angle. They found no weakness that siege engines could exploit. They found no way to surround the fortress and starve it into submission. The narrow path to the summit was so treacherous that his legionnaires would have to climb in single file, making them easy targets for the defenders above. Each man who fell would block the path for those behind him. Hundreds would die just to reach the walls, and then the real fighting would begin. Agricola made his decision. This fortress was not worth the blood it would cost to take it. His mission was to conquer Scotland, not to waste his army on a single stronghold, however strategic. He bypassed Din Aiden and continued north, leaving the Votadini to glare down at his passing legions from their unassailable perch. It was the first of many times that Edinburgh would prove unconquerable. The irony was complete. The greatest military machine in the ancient world had been defeated not by an army, but by geology itself. The conquerors had become the conquered, forced to retreat by a fortress they could not even reach. The Romans would march north and win great battles. They would defeat the Caledonians at Mons Graupius and claim to have conquered all of Scotland. But when winter came, they would retreat south to their bases in England. They would build Hadrian's Wall to keep the Scots out of Roman Britain. They would build the Antonine Wall further north in an attempt to hold more Scottish territory, but they would never fully conquer the fortress on the rock. For 3 centuries, the Romans would rule southern Britain. They would build cities and roads and temples. They would bring Latin law and Roman gods and Mediterranean luxuries. But the north would remain free, and at its heart would stand Din Aydin, still unconquered, still defiant. The long conflict with Rome shaped the character of the people who lived in the fortress. They learned that they could not defeat the legions in open battle. Roman discipline and equipment were too superior, but they could survive, they could endure, they could outlast empires if they were patient and stubborn enough. They learned the value of strategic patience, of choosing the right moment to fight and the right moment to retreat. They learned that sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to surrender. These lessons would serve the Scottish people well in the centuries to come. 300 years later, the Western Roman Empire began to crumble. The legions were withdrawn from the northern frontier to defend Rome itself against barbarian invasions. The Great Wall built by Hadrian began to crumble as its garrisons were abandoned. For the first time in centuries, there was no Roman threat from the south, but the departure of Rome did not bring peace to the borderlands. Instead, it unleashed a chaos of tribal warfare that would last for generations. The Votadini found themselves caught between competing powers. From the west came the Scots, Gaelic-speaking peoples from Ireland who were establishing kingdoms in what is now western Scotland. From the east came the Angles, Germanic warriors who were conquering what would become northern England. From the north came the Picts, the mysterious painted people who controlled the Scottish Highlands. Each of these peoples wanted control of the strategic crossroads where Din Aydin stood. The fortress on the rock changed hands multiple times during these chaotic centuries. Sometimes it was held by Celtic warriors speaking languages related to Welsh. Sometimes it was controlled by Germanic kings whose ancestors had crossed the North Sea to seek new lands. The battles for control were fierce and bloody. Armies besieged the rock. They built towers and brought up catapults. They tried to storm the walls and break down the gates. Many died in these attacks, but the fortress endured. Its position was simply too strong to be easily overcome. Whoever controlled the rock controlled the most important military position in southern Scotland. The narrow pass between the Pentland Hills forced all traffic between the Scottish Highlands and the English lowlands to flow past the volcanic summit. Any army wanting to invade Scotland from the south would have to deal with the fortress on the rock. Any Scottish force wanting to raid south into England would need to secure their route past this strategic stronghold. In the 6th century, a new player entered this deadly game. A Northumbrian king named Edwin the Bright had carved out a powerful kingdom in what is now northern England. Edwin was not content with ruling only the land south of the border. He looked north toward the Scottish hills and saw opportunity. In a series of brilliant campaigns, he conquered much of southern Scotland, including the fortress on the rock. But Edwin understood that conquest was only the beginning. To hold what he had won, he needed to make it truly his own. He looked up at the ancient Celtic stronghold and envisioned something greater. For the first time, the fortress would become more than a military position. It would become the seed of a civilization. Edwin was a builder as well as a warrior. He expanded the fortress, adding new walls and towers and halls fit for a king. He brought the finest craftsmen from across his kingdom to work with the local stone, creating buildings that married beauty with strength. With the local stone, creating buildings that were both beautiful and defensible. He established a royal court on the rock, complete with a great hall where he could feast his warriors and receive tribute from conquered enemies. But perhaps most importantly, he gave the fortress a new name, Edwin's Burh. Edwin's town. The name would evolve over the centuries, but the connection would endure. Edinburgh was born not as a Scottish city, but as the capital of a Northumbrian king. The irony would not be lost on later Scottish patriots, but it established the pattern that would define Edinburgh's history. This was a place where power naturally concentrated, where kingdoms were made and unmade, where the future of nations was decided. Edwin's reign brought prosperity to the fortress and the surrounding lands. Trade flourished along the protected roads. Monasteries were established where monks copied manuscripts and preserved learning. The court attracted poets and craftsmen from across northern Britain. For a brief shining moment, it seemed that Edwin might succeed in creating a lasting northern empire centred on his fortress. But power built on conquest is always fragile, especially when it depends on the life of a single man. Edwin was killed in battle in 633 AD, fighting against a coalition of Welsh and Mercian enemies. His kingdom fragmented almost immediately. Different parts were seized by rival claimants. The fortress on the rock once again became a prize to be fought over by competing powers. For the next 3 centuries, Edinburgh would change hands repeatedly. Picts, Scots, Angles, and Vikings would all claim it at various times. Each group left their mark on the rock. Each added to its defences or rebuilt what their predecessors had constructed. Each recognised the crucial importance of controlling this strategic position. The constant warfare had an unexpected effect on the people who lived in and around the fortress. They learned to adapt to changing rulers while maintaining their own identity. They learned to survive by being useful to whoever happened to be in power. They developed the flexibility and pragmatism that would characterise the people of Edinburgh for centuries to come. Then came a king who would change everything. Malcolm III, called Canmore or Great Head, established his court at Edinburgh. It was a calculated decision that would reshape the history of Scotland. Malcolm had spent his youth in exile at the English court after his father Duncan was murdered by Macbeth. Yes, that Macbeth, though the real story was rather different from Shakespeare's version. Malcolm had learned the value of symbolism and the importance of strategic position during his years in England. When he finally reclaimed his throne, he understood that where a king chose to hold his court mattered as much as the battles he won. By making Edinburgh his capital, Malcolm was declaring that Scotland would be a unified kingdom centred on this ancient fortress. He was also making a statement about Scotland's relationship with England. The fortress that had once been held by English kings was now the seat of Scottish royal power. It was a declaration of independence that could be read from miles away. Malcolm's queen was an English princess named Margaret, later known as Saint Margaret. She was a woman of extraordinary intelligence, piety, and political skill. Margaret looked around the crude fortress that was now her home and saw possibilities that others had missed. The rock was strong, defensible, and strategically placed, but it was not beautiful. It was not worthy of a great kingdom or a devout Christian queen. Margaret would change that. For the first time since the Votadini, someone would transform the fortress, not just for war, but for the spirit. She commissioned the building of a small chapel on the highest point of the rock, using the finest white stone that could be quarried from the surrounding hills. The chapel was dedicated to the worship of God, but it was also a statement that this ancient stronghold could nurture souls as well as shelter bodies. St. Margaret's Chapel still stands today, over 900 years later. It is the oldest building in Edinburgh, a testimony to the vision of a medieval queen who understood the power of beautiful architecture to inspire and uplift. But Margaret's true legacy was not architectural. It was cultural and intellectual. She brought scholars and priests to the court, men who could read Latin and Greek, and who carried with them the learning of medieval Europe. She established schools where noble children could learn to read and write. She founded libraries where manuscripts could be copied and preserved. She encouraged trade with the continent, bringing new ideas and new luxuries to Scotland. Under Margaret's influence, Edinburgh began its long transformation from a warrior's fortress into something more sophisticated and cosmopolitan. It became a centre of learning and culture that would attract talented people from across Northern Europe. The court became a place where poetry was recited and music was performed, where theological debates were held and new ideas about government and law were discussed. This transformation would take centuries to complete, and it would be forged in the crucible of warfare, more brutal and destructive than anything the ancient Votadini had ever experienced. But the foundations were laid during Margaret's reign, the foundations of a culture that valued learning and beauty alongside military prowess and political power. When Margaret died in 1093, she left behind a kingdom that was stronger and more sophisticated than the one she had found. Her children would continue her work, establishing Edinburgh as not just the political capital of Scotland, but as its cultural and intellectual heart as well. The 12th and 13th centuries would see Edinburgh grow from a royal stronghold into a true medieval city, complete with merchants and craftsmen, churches and schools, the bustling life of a community that was becoming more than just a fortress on a rock. But this growth would also bring new challenges and new enemies, including the greatest threat Scotland had ever faced. In 1296, the English king Edward Longshanks invaded Scotland with the largest army ever assembled in medieval Europe. His goal was nothing less than the complete conquest and absorption of Scotland into his English empire. Edward was not a man to be underestimated. He had conquered Wales through a combination of military brilliance, political cunning, and sheer ruthless determination. He intended to do the same to Scotland. He had studied the campaigns of his predecessors and learned from their mistakes. This would not be a raid for plunder or a temporary occupation. This would be conquest in the Roman style, complete and permanent. Edward's first target was the symbolic heart of Scottish independence. Edinburgh Castle fell to his siege engines within days. The Scottish garrison was slaughtered or enslaved. The royal regalia, the crown and sceptre, and sword that symbolised Scottish kingship were carted off to London as trophies. The Stone of Destiny, on which Scottish kings had been crowned for centuries, was seized and installed in Westminster Abbey as a footstool for English kings. For a brief, terrible moment, it seemed that Scotland, as an independent nation, was finished. This was Scotland's darkest hour, 1,000 years of freedom reduced to ashes and chain. The speed and completeness of Edward's initial victory stunned contemporary observers. No one had expected the Scots to collapse so quickly, but this was only the beginning of the story, not the end. The Scots had survived Roman legions and Viking raids and centuries of internal warfare. They were not about to surrender their independence without a fight, no matter how hopeless the odds seemed. Rebellion erupted across the country, first in isolated pockets of resistance, then spreading like wildfire from glen to glen and castle to castle. The names of the leaders of this resistance have become legendary. William Wallace, the younger son of a minor noble family, who defeated a much larger English army at Stirling Bridge through superior tactics and sheer audacity. Robert the Bruce, who claimed the Scottish crown and waged guerrilla warfare against English occupying forces for years. These men understood that they could not defeat English armies in conventional battles. The English had too many advantages in numbers, equipment, and resources, but they could make conquest so expensive and dangerous that even Edward Longshanks would eventually decide it was not worth the cost. The wars of Scottish independence would rage for over 30 years, devastating the country and killing thousands of people. Edinburgh would change hands repeatedly during these wars, sometimes taken by siege, sometimes by treachery, sometimes by the kind of desperate courage that enters into legend. The most famous capture of Edinburgh Castle came in 1314, just after the great Scottish victory at Bannockburn had secured Bruce's position as king. The castle was still held by an English garrison that refused to surrender even after their cause was clearly lost. Robert the Bruce gave the task of retaking the fortress to Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, one of his most trusted lieutenants. Randolph studied the problem carefully. A direct assault would be costly and might well fail. The English garrison was experienced and well supplied. They could hold the walls against conventional attacks for months. But Randolph had grown up in the area. He knew the rock better than the English defenders did. He remembered stories his grandfather had told him about the castle, including tales that most people dismissed as impossible nonsense. One of these tales concerned a man named William Francis, who had once served in the castle garrison. Francis claimed that there was a way to climb the sheer north face of the rock. The cliff that everyone knew was unclimbable. He had done it himself, he said, as a young man trying to impress a girl who worked in the castle kitchens. It was a route used by smugglers and lovers, dangerous but possible for men with steady nerves and strong hands. Randolph decided to take the gamble. He chose 30 of his best men, warriors who had proven their courage in battle and their ability to follow orders without question. They waited for a moonless night when clouds covered the stars and the darkness was complete. Then, led by William Francis, they began their impossible climb. The north face of Edinburgh's rock is 300 feet of nearly vertical basalt. In daylight, it looks absolutely unclimbable. In the darkness, with only their hands and feet to guide them, it must have seemed like madness. One slip would mean certain death on the rocks below. The slightest sound would alert the sentries above. But these were men who had spent their lives in the Scottish hills, who knew how to move silently and how to find handholds on rock faces that looked smooth as glass. They climbed in complete silence, their weapons tied to their backs with leather cords, their hands bleeding from the sharp volcanic stone. The climb took hours. Francis whispered directions through clenched teeth. 2 feet left, there's a crack. Wait, sentry coming. Several times men nearly lost their grip and had to be steadied by their companions. Several times they had to wait motionless as English sentries passed overhead, so close they could smell the ale on the guards' breath and hear them complaining about the cold. When they finally reached the summit just before dawn, they found the castle walls unguarded on the north side. The English had never imagined that anyone could climb that cliff. Why waste men guarding an impossible approach? Within minutes, the Scottish raiders had overwhelmed the sleepy sentries and opened the gates to the main Scottish force waiting below. Edinburgh Castle was Scottish once again. The English garrison surrendered in their nightshirts, so complete was their shock at the impossible assault. Gates to the main Scottish force waiting below. Edinburgh Castle was Scottish once again. Robert the Bruce was so impressed by this feat of daring that he decided the castle was too dangerous to leave intact. If the Scots could take it by stealth, so could the English. Better to destroy it than to risk having it used against Scotland again. He ordered most of the fortifications demolished, keeping only St. Margaret's Chapel as a monument to Scotland's Christian heritage. For the next 50 years, Edinburgh Castle was largely a ruin, but the rock remained, and rocks, as the Scots had learned over the centuries, are harder to destroy than kingdoms or castles. When peace finally returned to Scotland in the 14th century, the Scots began to rebuild what the wars had destroyed. But this time, they built not just for war, but for peace. Edinburgh began to spread down from the rock onto the narrow ridge that extended eastward toward the surrounding hills. This ridge, which would become known as the Royal Mile, became the spine of the medieval city. It was here that merchants and craftsmen built their houses and workshops. It was here that the great Cathedral of St. Giles would rise to rival the castle on its rocky perch. The Royal Mile was unlike any other street in medieval Europe. It was built on a narrow ridge of rock with steep slopes called winds or closes running down both sides like the ribs of a great fish skeleton. These winds became the arteries of medieval Edinburgh, narrow alleyways where the common people lived in tall, narrow buildings that climbed up the slopes in defiance of gravity and common sense. The city had become a living creature, stretched along the volcanic ridge, its heart beating in the castle above, its lifeblood flowing through the winds below. Walk down one of these winds in the year 1400, and you would find yourself in a different world. The houses were built of local stone, grey and solid, designed to withstand the fierce winds that swept down from the highlands. They were tall and narrow, because space was limited on the ridge, sometimes rising 6 or 7 stories above the steep street. Families often lived in single rooms, sharing their space with animals during the coldest months of winter. The smell was overpowering, a mixture of unwashed bodies, cooking food, animal waste, and the smoke from countless fires. Waste was thrown from windows into the streets below. The noise was constant and chaotic. Merchants called out prices in Scots, a dialect that sounded almost like a foreign language to visitors. Children played in the narrow streets, dodging horses and carts. But there was also energy and community in these crowded streets. Neighbours knew each other and looked out for each other's welfare. Craftsmen took pride in their work and passed their skills down through generations. The guild system ensured that standards were maintained and that everyone had a role to play in the economic life of the city. Above it all loomed Edinburgh Castle, rebuilt and stronger than ever after the devastation of the Independence Wars. The royal court had returned to the Rock, bringing with it all the pageantry and politics that surrounded medieval kingship. From the castle's great hall, Scottish kings ruled a nation that had survived its greatest trial and emerged more united than ever before. The castle was once again a symbol of Scottish independence, but it was also something more. It was becoming the centre of a culture that valued learning and debate alongside military prowess and political skill. Edinburgh was becoming something unique in medieval Europe. It was a capital city that had never truly surrendered to foreign conquest, a fortress that had learned to think, a place where warriors and scholars could live side by side and learn from each other. But the greatest test of this unique character was yet to come. In the 16th century, Scotland would be torn apart by a religious revolution that would reshape not just the country's faith, but its entire approach to education, governance, and social organisation. And at the centre of this revolution would stand a man whose name would become synonymous with Scottish Protestantism, and whose ideas would help create the intellectual culture that would eventually produce the Scottish Enlightenment. The man's name was John Knox, and his story begins in the narrow winds of medieval Edinburgh, where a young priest was about to discover ideas that would change the world. John Knox was born around 1514 in the countryside east of Edinburgh, the son of a farmer who had managed to send his boy to school in the hope that education might provide a better life than working the land. Knox was ordained as a Catholic priest in the 1530s at a time when the Catholic Church was the undisputed spiritual authority in Scotland. But the Church in Scotland, like the Church throughout Europe, was facing a crisis of authority and legitimacy. The wealth and corruption of many church officials had become scandalous. Bishops lived like princes while common people struggled to survive. The sale of indulgences, which promised to reduce time in purgatory in exchange for money, had become a profitable business that many saw as a perversion of true Christianity. Across Europe, new ideas were spreading like wildfire. The German monk Martin Luther had challenged papal authority and argued that salvation came through faith alone, not through the sacraments administered by priests. These ideas were spreading through Scotland despite official attempts to suppress them. Knox encountered these Protestant ideas while working as a tutor to the sons of wealthy families in East Lothian. He began to read the works of Luther and other reformers, and he found in them answers to questions that had been troubling him about the corruption and worldliness he saw in the Catholic Church. By the mid-1540s, Knox had become a Protestant convert, though he kept his conversion secret for reasons of personal safety. The Catholic Church was still powerful in Scotland, and heresy was punishable by burning at the stake. But events were moving quickly toward a crisis that would transform Scotland forever. In 1546, Cardinal David Beaton, the most powerful Catholic leader in Scotland, was murdered by Protestant conspirators in his castle at St Andrews. Knox joined the conspirators, not as a plotter but as a chaplain and teacher. When the castle was finally recaptured by a French fleet in 1547, Knox was taken prisoner and sentenced to serve as a galley slave in the French Navy. For 19 months, he was chained to an oar in a French warship, forced to row in all weather, and fed barely enough to keep him alive. It was a brutal experience that would have broken many men. But Knox survived, and his time as a galley slave only strengthened his hatred of what he saw as Catholic tyranny. When he was finally released in a prisoner exchange, he made his way to England, where the young Protestant king Edward VI was reforming the English church along Protestant lines. Knox became a royal chaplain and learned firsthand how religious reform could be implemented from above. But when the Catholic Mary Tudor came to the English throne in 1553 and began burning Protestant reformers, Knox fled to the continent. He spent the next 5 years in Geneva learning from John Calvin, the great Protestant theologian who had turned that Swiss city into a model of reformed Christian society. Calvin's ideas would have a profound influence on Knox's thinking. Calvin taught that God had predestined some people for salvation and others for damnation, and that the elect had a duty to create godly communities on earth. This was not a gentle or tolerant form of Christianity. It was demanding, uncompromising, and revolutionary in its implications. When Knox finally returned to Scotland in 1559, he brought with him ideas that would transform not just Scottish religion, but Scottish society as a whole. His first public sermon was preached at St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh. The crowd that gathered to hear him was restless and angry. They had grievances against the Catholic Church that went beyond theology. The Church owned vast amounts of land, while common people struggled to survive. Church courts imposed harsh punishments for moral offences, while church officials lived in luxury and corruption. Many people were ready for change, but they needed a leader who could articulate their grievances and provide a vision of something better. Knox gave them that leadership. He preached with the passion and authority of an Old Testament prophet. He thundered against the corruption of the Catholic Church. He denounced the wealth of the monasteries while common people starved. He called the Pope the Antichrist and the Catholic Mass a form of idolatry. He declared that ordinary Christians had the right and duty to read the Bible for themselves rather than simply accepting what priests told them to believe. The effect was electrifying. Within hours of Knox's sermon, the Edinburgh mob was rampaging through the city. They smashed the stained glass windows of St. Giles Cathedral, coloured fragments raining down like deadly confetti. They burned the carved wooden statues of saints that had adorned the church for centuries, the smell of burning oak mixing with the smoke of revolution. They looted the monasteries and drove out the Catholic priests who had served them, tearing gold crucifixes from altars and spilling holy water onto cobblestone streets. In a single afternoon, 1,000 years of Catholic Scotland came to a violent and chaotic end. Knox watched the destruction with satisfaction rather than horror. He saw it as the righteous anger of God's people finally breaking free from centuries of spiritual oppression. Scotland had been transformed in a single day. The age of unquestioning faith was over. The age of intellectual inquiry had begun. But Knox was not content to simply destroy the old religious order. He wanted to build something new and better in its place. His vision was of a Scotland where every child could read the Bible, where every parish had a school, where learning and moral behaviour were valued above birth and wealth. It was a radical vision for the 16th century, when education was usually restricted to the wealthy and powerful. Knox and his followers set about implementing this vision with the same energy they had shown in destroying Catholicism. They established schools in parishes across Scotland. They founded new universities to train Protestant ministers. They created a system of church government that gave ordinary people a voice in selecting their spiritual leaders. They insisted that everyone, regardless of social class, should be able to read the Bible and participate in religious discussions. The effects of this educational revolution would not be fully felt for generations. But over the coming centuries, Scotland would develop one of the most literate populations in Europe. Scottish universities would attract students from around the world. The culture of debate and inquiry that Knox had promoted would eventually produce the philosophers and scientists who would create the Scottish Enlightenment. Knox died in 1572, but his influence lived on in the institutions he had created and the attitudes he had instilled in the Scottish people. He had taught the Scots to question authority, to value education, and to believe that ordinary people could understand complex ideas if they were given the chance to learn. These lessons would serve Scotland well in the centuries to come. But intellectual revolution was not the only kind of upheaval that Edinburgh would witness in the coming years. Political events would soon transform Scotland's relationship with its southern neighbour in ways that no one could have predicted. But before we explore those transformations, we must pause to tell the story of one of the most tragic and fascinating figures in all of Scottish history, a story that began and ended in Edinburgh. The story of Mary, Queen of Scots. She was born to rule a kingdom, raised in the most sophisticated court in Europe, and destroyed by passions that proved stronger than political wisdom. Her story is written in the stones of Edinburgh itself. Mary Stuart was born in 1542, becoming Queen of Scotland when she was only 6 days old. To protect her from English schemes, she was sent to the French court, where she grew up in luxury and sophistication. At 15, she married the French heir, but when he died suddenly in 1560, she returned to Scotland at 18, a Catholic widow trying to rule a Protestant country she barely remembered. Mary arrived back in Edinburgh in August 1561. It was a grey, misty morning, quite different from the sunny skies of France. The city, she found, was transformed. John Knox's Protestant Revolution had swept away the Catholic Scotland of her childhood. The Mass was no longer celebrated in St Giles Cathedral. The monasteries had been dissolved. Many of the nobles who had known her father were dead. Mary was a Catholic queen, returning to rule a Protestant country, a French-educated woman trying to govern Scottish men who were suspicious of foreign influence. She established her court at Holyrood Palace at the foot of the Royal Mile, but she also kept apartments in Edinburgh Castle where she could retreat when the pressures of ruling became too great. Mary's early years as queen were relatively successful. She was intelligent and politically shrewd. She appointed Protestant ministers to key positions while quietly maintaining her own Catholic faith. She refused to ratify the Protestant religious settlement, but also refused to actively persecute Protestants. It was a delicate balancing act, but for a time it seemed to work. Mary enjoyed music and dancing. She rode and hunted. She played cards and chess. She wrote poetry and letters. She held elaborate court ceremonies that reminded people of Scotland's royal dignity. Many of her subjects, even Protestant ones, found her personally charming. But Mary's position was precarious. John Knox preached sermons denouncing female rulers. He called it monstrous that women should govern men. Elizabeth of England watched events in Scotland with concern. Mary had a strong claim to the English throne as the great-granddaughter of Henry VII. If English Catholics ever decided to rebel against Elizabeth, they might rally around Mary instead. This made Mary both valuable as an ally and dangerous as a potential enemy. Marriage was the key to Mary's future, but every possible marriage carried political risks. Mary's choice, when she finally made it, was disastrous. In 1565, she married her cousin Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Darnley was tall, handsome, and charming. He was also vain, weak, and politically naive. The marriage quickly became unhappy. Darnley demanded to be made king in his own right, not just the Queen's consort. When Mary refused, he began plotting against her. The situation deteriorated rapidly. In March 1566, Darnley conspired with Protestant nobles to murder Mary's Italian secretary, David Riccio. They suspected Riccio of being a papal agent and of having too much influence over the Queen. They also hoped that the shock might cause Mary to miscarry. She was 6 months pregnant at the time. The murder took place in Mary's private apartments at Holyrood Palace. Darnley and his accomplices burst into the Queen's supper chamber. They dragged Riccio from the room and stabbed him to death in an adjoining chamber. Mary was forced to watch. A dagger was held to her throat to prevent her from intervening. It was a horrific and traumatic experience. Mary never forgave her husband for his part in the murder. She gave birth to her son James in June 1566, but her marriage to Darnley was effectively over. She began to rely more heavily on other advisers, particularly James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. Bothwell was everything that Darnley was not. He was experienced, decisive, and ruthlessly practical. He was also married to someone else, and had a reputation as a man who took what he wanted. By early 1567, it was clear that Mary's marriage to Darnley could not continue. But divorce in the 16th century was almost impossible, especially for a reigning queen. The situation resolved itself in the most dramatic way possible. On the night of February 9th, 1567, Darnley was staying at a house called Kirk Field, just outside Edinburgh. In the early hours of February 10th, a massive explosion destroyed the house. Darnley's body was found in the garden, but he had not been killed by the explosion. He had been strangled. It was clearly murder, but who was responsible? Suspicion immediately fell on Bothwell, who had the means and the motive, and who was known to be close to the Queen. Mary's response to her husband's murder was puzzling. She did not demand a thorough investigation. She did not go into extended mourning. Instead, she continued to appear in public, to attend court functions, to behave as if nothing had happened. This gave rise to rumours that she had been complicit in the murder, that she had wanted Darnley dead, and had perhaps even planned his death with Bothwell. 3 months after Darnley's death, Bothwell was tried for the murder and acquitted, but the trial was widely seen as a sham. A few days after the trial, Bothwell intercepted Mary as she was travelling from Stirling to Edinburgh. He abducted her and took her to Dunbar Castle, where she remained for several weeks. What happened at Dunbar has never been fully explained. Mary later claimed that she had been raped, that she had been forced to agree to marry Bothwell against her will. But many contemporaries suspected that the abduction had been staged, that Mary had consented to the entire plan as a way of marrying Bothwell without appearing to act of her own free will. In May 1567, Mary married Bothwell in a Protestant ceremony. It was her third marriage, and by far her most controversial. The reaction was swift and devastating. A group of Protestant nobles raised an army. They called themselves the Confederate Lords. Their stated goal was to rescue Mary from Bothwell's influence and to bring Darnley's murderers to justice. The two armies met at Carberry Hill, near Edinburgh, in June 1567, but there was no battle. Bothwell's forces melted away during the day as it became clear that they were outnumbered. In the evening, Bothwell was allowed to escape. Mary surrendered and was imprisoned on Loch Leven, forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son. After escaping and losing one final battle, she fled to England. Elizabeth kept her prisoner for 19 years before executing her in 1587. She was 44, having ruled Scotland for only 6 tumultuous years. In 1587, after years of imprisonment, Mary was executed at Fotheringay Castle for treason against the English crown. She was 44 years old. She had been Queen of Scots for 25 years, but had ruled actively for only 6. Her story became legend. The beautiful young queen, destroyed by her own passions and political miscalculations. Poets and playwrights would retell her story for centuries. Even today, Mary, Queen of Scots, remains one of the most fascinating and controversial figures in Scottish history. Her legacy in Edinburgh is complex. The palace of Holyrood, where she held court and witnessed Riccio's murder, still stands. Edinburgh Castle, where Mary gave birth to James VI, remains the city's most famous landmark. Mary's story is a reminder that royal power in the 16th century was precarious, especially for women, that personal choices could have political consequences, that passion and politics do not mix well. But it is also a story about Edinburgh itself, about a city that was already becoming a place where ideas mattered as much as birth, where public opinion could make or unmake a monarch. The Edinburgh that Mary knew was still a medieval city, crowded and unsanitary, with narrow streets and tall buildings. But it was also a city that was learning to think for itself. The Protestant Reformation had taught its citizens to question authority and to value education. These lessons would serve Edinburgh well in the intellectual revolution that was about to begin. In 1603, Queen Elizabeth of England died childless, and the English throne passed to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. For the first time in history, Scotland and England were ruled by the same monarch. James moved his court south to London, taking with him many of the Scottish nobles and officials who had made Edinburgh the bustling centre of an independent kingdom. The city that had been the beating heart of a sovereign nation suddenly found itself relegated to the status of a provincial capital in a much larger realm. Many observers predicted that Edinburgh would fade into insignificance, becoming little more than a regional administrative centre. They could not have been more wrong. Instead of declining, Edinburgh adapted and reinvented itself. Without a royal court to provide employment and entertainment, the citizens of the city had to create their own institutions and their own culture. The fortress that had defended bodies for 1,000 years now began to defend something even more precious: ideas. They founded societies devoted to philosophy and science. They established libraries and built laboratories. They began to ask questions that had never been systematically explored before. Questions about human nature, about the workings of the mind, about the laws that governed society and the universe. The transformation was gradual but profound. By the early 18th century, Edinburgh was becoming something unprecedented in human history. A city where ideas mattered more than birth or wealth, where a university professor could be more famous and influential than a duke. This was the beginning of what historians would later call the Scottish Enlightenment, one of the most remarkable intellectual flowerings in human history. And it was about to change not just Scotland, but the entire world. Edinburgh was becoming something that had never existed before. A city powered not by commerce or conquest, but by pure thought. The Scottish Enlightenment was not a single event or movement, but a sustained explosion of intellectual creativity that lasted for nearly a century. It began in the universities but quickly spread to the coffee houses and taverns and private drawing rooms of Edinburgh. The city became a magnet for brilliant minds from across Europe and America. They came to study at the university, to participate in the debates of the philosophical societies, to be part of something extraordinary that was happening in this northern city, something miraculous. At the centre of it all was the University of Edinburgh, which had transformed itself from a small provincial institution into one of the great centres of learning in the world. The university's professors were not just teachers, but original researchers who made discoveries that advanced human knowledge. The medical school in particular had gained an international reputation. Students came from across the Atlantic and from every corner of Europe to study anatomy, chemistry, and the new science of medicine under professors who were pushing the boundaries of what was known about the human body and the treatment of disease. But it was not just the formal institutions that made Edinburgh special during this period. The city had developed a unique culture that encouraged intellectual experimentation and debate. Coffee houses became informal universities where anyone with something interesting to say could find an audience. The poker club and the select society brought together professors and merchants, lawyers and ministers, young students and established scholars, all united by their passion for ideas and their belief that human reason could solve the problems that had plagued humanity for centuries. Walk through Edinburgh on an evening in 1760, and you might encounter some of the most influential thinkers in human history. David Hume, perhaps the greatest philosopher who ever lived, could often be seen striding down the Canongate, his massive figure unmistakable even at a distance. Hume was the son of a minor Scottish landowner, but his intellect was anything but minor. He questioned everything that previous philosophers had taken for granted. How do we know what we know? What is the relationship between reason and emotion in human decision-making? What is the basis of our moral judgments? Is there any rational foundation for religious belief? His answers to these questions were so radical that they shocked even his fellow Enlightenment thinkers. Hume argued that much of what we think we know is actually just habit and custom, that our reasoning is often guided by our emotions rather than the other way around, that our moral judgments are based on feelings of approval and disapproval rather than abstract reasoning about right and wrong. These ideas were not just abstract philosophy confined to university lecture halls. They were intellectual dynamite that would influence thinkers from Immanuel Kant in Germany to Thomas Jefferson in America. But in Edinburgh itself, they caused scandal. In 1779, Hume completed his most radical work, the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, which questioned the very existence of God through reasoned argument. When he tried to publish it, the Edinburgh establishment erupted in fury. Ministers denounced him from their pulpits. The church threatened excommunication. University officials warned of riots. Publishers refused to touch the manuscript, crossing themselves as they turned away from his door. Even Hume's friends begged him to reconsider. The atmosphere was electric with tension as the philosopher who had dined with kings and corresponded with Voltaire found himself branded a dangerous atheist in his own city. The manuscript was hidden away, published only after his death. It was a reminder that even in the Athens of the North, some ideas were still too radical for their time. Kant would later say that Hume had awakened him from his dogmatic slumber and forced him to completely rethink his philosophical system. Jefferson would draw on Hume's political philosophy when writing the Declaration of Independence. But Hume was not the only genius walking the streets of Edinburgh during this remarkable period. Adam Smith, Hume's close friend and intellectual companion, was working on a book that would revolutionize how humanity thought about economics and social organization. Smith had begun his career as a moral philosopher, writing about ethics and human nature, but he had become fascinated by economic questions. How is wealth created? What determines the value of goods and services? How do markets work? What is the proper role of government in economic affairs? One afternoon in a Glasgow workshop, Smith watched 10 men making pins. Each performed one task: cutting wire, sharpening points, attaching heads. Together, they produced 48,000 pins per day. One man alone could make perhaps 20. In that moment, Smith understood something profound about how division of labour creates wealth. The invisible hand of the market could organise human activity more efficiently than any king or parliament. Smith spent years observing the economic life of Edinburgh and Glasgow, watching merchants trade in the markets, studying the organisation of production in workshops and factories, thinking about the complex web of relationships that connected producers and consumers across the globe. The book he was writing, The Wealth of Nations, would argue that free markets, guided by what he called an invisible hand, could create prosperity and coordinate economic activity more effectively than government planning or traditional forms of economic organisation. The Edinburgh Medical School was making equally important contributions to human knowledge. In the anatomy theatre, professors demonstrated the workings of the human body to fascinated students from across Europe. In the chemistry laboratory, a professor named Joseph Black was heating limestone in a furnace when he noticed something strange. The heated rock gave off a gas that could extinguish candles and kill mice. He had discovered what we now call carbon dioxide, though he simply called it fixed air. His discovery would prove crucial to understanding how breathing and burning worked. Meanwhile, a geologist named James Hutton was walking through the Scottish countryside, looking at rock formations and wondering how they had formed. His observations would eventually challenge the biblical account of creation and help scientists understand that the Earth was far older than anyone had imagined. What made all of this intellectual ferment possible? How did a small northern city become the intellectual capital of the Western world? The answer lies in the unique culture that had developed in Edinburgh over the centuries, a culture shaped by religious reformation, political conflict, and the democratic traditions of Scottish Presbyterianism. The Presbyterian Church had created a society that valued education and intellectual achievement. Every parish was supposed to have a school. Every minister was expected to be able to defend his theological positions through argument and scriptural interpretation. This created a population that was unusually literate and intellectually curious. The long history of conflict with England had also played a crucial role. The Scots had learned not to accept authority simply because it claimed to be legitimate. They had developed habits of independent thinking and skeptical inquiry that served them well when applied to intellectual questions. Most importantly, Edinburgh had developed a culture that was remarkably egalitarian by the standards of the time. Social distinctions existed, of course, but they were not absolute. A professor could gain more respect than a lord if he had something interesting to say. A merchant's son could rise to prominence through education and talent rather than birth. This social mobility and intellectual meritocracy created an environment where the best ideas could flourish regardless of their source. The philosophers and scientists of Edinburgh were not content to simply theorize in their studies. They wanted their ideas to have practical applications that would improve human life. This was one of the defining characteristics of the Scottish Enlightenment. Its combination of abstract thinking with practical concern for human welfare. Adam Smith's economic theories were developed not just as intellectual exercises, but as guides for policymakers seeking to increase national wealth and individual prosperity. David Hume's philosophy included extensive discussions of politics and history because he wanted to understand how societies could be better organized and governed. The medical discoveries made at Edinburgh were immediately applied to treating disease and alleviating suffering. This practical orientation would become one of Scotland's greatest exports. Scottish-trained doctors, engineers, administrators, and teachers would carry Enlightenment ideas to every corner of the globe. They would establish schools in Canada, build railroads in India, create legal systems in Australia, and help design the government institutions of the new United States of America. The ideas that had been born in the coffee houses and lecture halls of Edinburgh would help shape the modern world. Yet while Edinburgh's ideas travelled the globe, the city itself faced a crisis. By the mid-18th century, the old town was becoming desperately overcrowded and unsanitary. The narrow wynds and closes that had housed medieval merchants were now packed with tens of thousands of people. Rich and poor lived in the same buildings, with the wealthy occupying the lower floors and the poor crowded into the upper stories and cellars. The conditions were often appalling. Waste was thrown from windows into the streets below. Disease was rampant. The smell was overwhelming. Even the wealthy lived in circumstances that would be considered intolerable today. Something had to be done if Edinburgh was to maintain its position as a centre of learning and culture. The solution came from an unexpected source. A competition was announced for the design of a new district that would provide housing for Edinburgh's growing professional and merchant classes. The winning design came from a young architect named James Craig, who was barely 26 years old when his plan was selected. Craig's design was revolutionary by the standards of the time. Instead of the chaotic, medieval growth pattern of the old town, he envisioned a district of wide, straight streets laid out in a perfect grid. The new town would be a masterpiece of Georgian architecture, a physical embodiment of Enlightenment ideals of order, reason, and beauty. Here was the Athens to complement the fortress. Construction began in 1767, and within 50 years the new town had become one of the most beautiful urban districts in Europe. The main streets, Prince's Street and George Street, were laid out with mathematical precision. Elegant squares like Charlotte Square provided focal points where the wealthy could see and be seen. The entire district was built from the same honey-coloured sandstone quarried from the countryside around Edinburgh, giving it a visual unity that was breathtaking to behold. The houses were tall and graceful, with large windows designed to capture as much light as possible in the northern climate. The new town was more than just an architectural achievement. It was a social experiment that would have profound implications for the development of modern urban life. For the first time in Edinburgh's history, the wealthy classes could live separately from the poor. They abandoned the old town with its crowded tenements and medieval wynds for spacious Georgian mansions with private gardens and elegant interiors. This created a divided city that would shape Edinburgh's development for centuries to come. The old town retained its medieval character and became the domain of the working classes, while the new town housed the professional and merchant elites, who were the backbone of Edinburgh's intellectual life. But the division was not absolute. The University of Edinburgh, strategically located between the two districts, continued to draw students and faculty from both areas. The result was a unique social dynamic that combined the energy and authenticity of the old town with the sophistication and elegance of the new town. Edinburgh had become a city that could offer both the intimacy of medieval community life and the refinement of 18th century urbanism. As the 18th century drew to a close, Edinburgh could justly claim to be one of the most important cities in the world. Visitors came from across Europe and America to experience what they called the Athens of the North. They marvelled at the beauty of the architecture, the sophistication of the intellectual life, and the remarkable achievements of a relatively small city that had produced so many influential thinkers and innovators. But this golden age was about to face its greatest challenge. The French Revolution had erupted in 1789, sending shockwaves across Europe and the world. The revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity appealed to many people in Edinburgh who had been influenced by Enlightenment thinking about natural rights and democratic government. But the revolution quickly turned violent. The execution of King Louis XVI in 1793 horrified European monarchs and conservative thinkers. War broke out between revolutionary France and a coalition of European powers that included Britain. The British government, terrified that revolutionary ideas might spread from France to Britain, cracked down hard on anyone suspected of sympathising with French radicalism. Edinburgh intellectuals, who had once freely debated the nature of government and the rights of man, found themselves under government surveillance and suspicion. Some were arrested and tried for sedition. Others chose exile rather than risk prosecution for their political views. The atmosphere of free intellectual inquiry that had made the Scottish Enlightenment possible came under severe pressure. But Edinburgh had survived worse threats before. The city's intellectual life did not disappear, it simply became more cautious and circumspect. Philosophical societies continued to meet, but they avoided explicitly political topics. Publishers became more careful about what books and pamphlets they would print. Ideas continued to spread, but more quietly and indirectly than during the heyday of the earlier Enlightenment. When the Napoleonic Wars finally ended in 1815, Edinburgh emerged with its reputation for intellectual achievement intact and perhaps even enhanced. The experience of wartime repression had only strengthened the city's commitment to intellectual freedom and its belief that ideas should be judged on their merits, rather than their political implications. The new century would bring new challenges and new triumphs. Edinburgh adapted brilliantly to the age of steam and industry. Scottish engineers trained here designed the steam engines that powered the Industrial Revolution. Edinburgh publishers spread new knowledge across the English-speaking world. Sir Walter Scott's romantic novels created a tourism industry that brought visitors from across Europe and America to see where Knox preached and Hume walked. The city developed as Britain's second financial centre, and in 1999, the Scottish Parliament was reconstituted after nearly 3 centuries. The city that began as a fortress defending independence had once again become the seat of Scottish power. Perhaps most significantly, Edinburgh reclaimed its role as a centre of political power when the Scottish Parliament was reconstituted in 1999 after nearly 3 centuries of union with England. The circle had come full. The city that began as a fortress defending Scottish independence had once again become the seat of Scottish political power. But this new Scotland sought to influence the world through ideas and culture rather than military conquest. Today, Edinburgh remains what it has always been, a city that punches above its weight in global influence. The university continues as a world-leading institution. The festivals make it a cultural capital. The financial sector embraces new technologies while maintaining Scottish traditions of prudent analysis. The spirit that made Edinburgh the Athens of the North is still alive in its lecture halls and laboratories, its theatres and galleries, its pubs and coffee houses, where the next generation gathers to debate and dream. The city continues to attract people who believe that ideas matter, that education can change lives, that small places can have large influence. The Votadini, who first built their fortress on the volcanic rock, could never have imagined what their settlement would become. They were simply trying to survive, to create a place where they could defend themselves and raise their children in safety. But in choosing that rocky summit, they chose something more profound. They chose a place where independence would always be valued over conformity, where new ideas would find refuge, where the pursuit of knowledge would be seen as a noble calling. The rock still stands solid and enduring. The castle still crowns its summit, a reminder of the military struggles that shaped Scottish history. But Edinburgh itself has become more than just a city built on a rock. It has become an idea that lives in the human mind and heart. The idea that small nations can have great influence. The idea that education is the key to human progress. The idea that diversity of thought leads to strength rather than weakness. The idea that a fortress built to resist armies could become a fortress that launches ideas, ideas that would sail across oceans and reshape continents. From a Celtic hill fort to the Athens of the North, from a warrior's stronghold to a city of scholars and artists, Edinburgh has always been a place where ideas mattered more than armies, where the future was more important than the past, where human potential seemed limitless if given the proper environment to flourish. The volcanic rock that once offered only physical security now offers something infinitely more valuable. It offers hope. And so our story of Edinburgh comes to a close, though the city's story continues to unfold with each passing day. It has been a pleasure to walk these ancient streets with you, to witness these remarkable transformations, to see how a fortress built for survival became a lighthouse for the world. The Votadini were wiser than they knew when they chose that volcanic summit. They sought only safety from their enemies. What they found was a foundation for human greatness itself. It was worth more than temporary security. It was worth the future itself, the future of a people and culture that would give gifts of immeasurable value to all humanity. From their crude stronghold came philosophers who changed how we think, scientists who unlocked the secrets of nature, and ideas that lit up the darkness of ignorance across the world. Thank you for listening to this journey through the centuries. Until our next exploration of the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night.